standing here today at the Monmouth Battlefield State Park in New Jersey, and it was here on June 28, 1778 that the Battle of Monmouth was fought. Following what's become known as the Philadelphia Campaign in 1777 and 1778, when the British looked to take the fight to the Continentals and crush them in and around their capital of Philadelphia, the Continentals had been defeated at both Brandywine and Germantown. The British occupied Philadelphia, and the Continental Army famously decamped for Valley Forge for the winter of 1778. It was there through all of that hardship and strife that they also found their training with a Prussian officer by the name of Baron von Steuben, who trained them to be a more disciplined army, much more like the ones that they were fighting against and that George Washington had been experienced in fighting among during his time in the French and Indian War as a British officer. By June of 1778, the British were decamping from Philadelphia, hoping to go to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, to catch their fleets and go back to New York City, where they were, where their main command was throughout most of the war, and from there redeploy elsewhere. Hoping to nab this long line of troops withdrawing from Philadelphia, George Washington ordered Charles Lee to fight in action and catch up with the rear guard of that long line, which included 1,500 baggage wagons at the front, that was commanded by Knyphausen, who was a German officer who was fighting on behalf of the British for most of the war. Lee caught up with the rear guard of Clinton's army on early of that morning of June 28, 1778. Fought some quick skirmishes against them. Quickly thought that he was being outnumbered as Clinton rushed Cornwallis to his rear to shore up what was happening at the back of his long line. Lee withdrew from that fight, feeling as though he was being outnumbered and overwhelmed. Washington came up mid-morning, angrily had an exchange with Lee to hold the line. Washington redeployed his troops, most of his body, on this hill over here to the side here, while most of the British troops were through, it's hard to see today, but through this cut of the trees there was this hedgerow. Today it's got a fence line at it, where there was a lot of vicious fighting back and forth through most of the day. By the end of the day, with the Continental Army sort of up on this hill here, with a cannonade firing on the British field guns down here at this hedgerow, it was a bit of a back and forth artillery battle for most of the afternoon, until up here on where I'm standing today, what's called Combs Hill, Nathaniel Greene came up with some artillery and created sort of a firing down the line at this hedgerow, while the main cannonade from the Continentals continued to fire from Perrine Hill over here, eventually forcing the British to move on. British eventually did move on to Sandy Hook. They got on their ships and they redeployed to New York City. It wasn't a great strategic battle, although the Continentals did hold the field at the end of it. The casualties were about 3 times the size on the British side than on the American side, but it did wind up causing some ongoing strife, as Charles Lee was court-martialed for failing to act properly under Washington's command at the battle, and then there was some fighting between Lee and Washington for much of the remainder of the war in their lives. The other, interesting things, this was a real who's who of the American Revolution that was here. Not only did you have Clinton, Knyphausen, Cornwallis on the British side, but other personalities other than Washington and Lee were here. Nathan Hale was here, Aaron Burr was here, Lafayette was here, There's a whole host of course, von Steuben was here, Nathaniel Green was here, Henry Knox was here. So there was a real meeting of a lot of the personalities that defined that whole era. Today, the battlefield, like I said, is a state park. It's really beautiful. It's about 1,800 acres. There's a lot of trails to hike. A lot of it is farmed today actively, and here in early October, there's a lot of corn and apples and cherries and pumpkins around the trails and across the battlefield. So at about 1,800 acres, it's a little less than a third of the size of someplace like Gettysburg, which is another very large battlefield of about 6,000 acres. But it's worth the trip. It's really beautiful. And in better times, I will say, the visitor center that's here has a remarkable series of exhibits about the battle and the revolution in New Jersey. Today it's closed for the COVID-19 virus pandemic, which is ongoing. But I'd say a trip and a hike around the Monmouth battlefield is well worth the trip.